Want to follow along this morning and take your Bibles out and be turning to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. And we're going to be looking at our third lesson in our series on the life of David this morning. And this one is based upon both chapters 18 and 19. And it's a little bit of a different lesson, but nonetheless, I think it's a subject that's dealt with pretty extensively here in these couple of chapters. And that is the idea of dealing with difficult people. And if I were to ask you the question, have you ever had to deal with difficult people? I think probably all of us would say, yeah, at some time in our life or another, we've had to deal with people who are difficult people to get along with or to associate with or cooperate with. And it's not something that's uncommon in life. And when you think about last week's lesson, you know, we studied about how David had just killed Goliath and how Israel had just won this tremendous victory over the Philistines, their enemies. And the name of David went from basically being unknown, being a very obscure name, to being a household name. I mean, you think about David, nobody knew him, or not very many people knew him when he was this young shepherd and this young musician. But now everybody knows him as this famous warrior, this man who conquered the giant Goliath. After David defeats Goliath, he's brought before Saul, and Saul wants to know a little bit more about David himself, what family he's from, you know, a little bit about his background. And as Saul is dealing with him, his oldest son, Jonathan, is also there with Saul. And what happens is, not only, you know, there are a lot of people who are impressed by David, but Jonathan, Saul's son, who is the next heir to the throne of Israel, he's very enamored with him. And in fact, David and Jonathan very quickly form a bond. This bond is sealed by a covenant. Jonathan gives him his robe. He also ends up giving David his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt. And what that means is, that means David here, from this very obscure shepherd boy, is now armed with some of the greatest weapons that Israel has to offer. And David is put in charge of a lot of things. Because of his success in this military operation, Saul takes him into his family to live with him in his castle. He said, you're no longer going to live with your family. And he starts putting him in charge of things. And he quickly realizes whatever he puts David in charge of, David has great success with it. And so naturally, Saul eventually makes him the commander of all his men of war. And the Bible tells us one day, after a great victory, look in 1 Samuel 18 with me, verses 6 and 7. It says, it came to pass as they came, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000. You know, that single event caused a chain reaction, I guess you could say, within the life of David and Saul. From that day forward, after Saul heard this song that the women were singing about him, how he had only killed thousands of men, but David had killed tens of thousands, then David's relationship with Saul became a very difficult one. And that's what we want to think about, and that's what we want to study here in chapters 18 and 19, about how to deal with difficult people. And the first thing that we're going to look at in this lesson is we need to remember why people are difficult to deal with sometimes. And, you know, we're kind of right now at a point, I think, in our nation, or at least some people are, where they're questioning or they're testing their higher sensitivity toward other people. And, you know, I'm not bringing these things up this morning because I'm saying, well, we should be sympathetic toward those who are difficult people. we need to understand what often causes people to be difficult. But I think the main reason that we need to understand it is so that we don't become difficult people ourselves. We need to avoid falling into that trap. And so let's think about why it is that Saul became a difficult person to deal with when it came to David. The first thing that we read about in verse 8, remember we read how these women came out and they sang this song. And notice Saul's reaction in verse 8. It says, "And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom?" What was the reaction of Saul? Well, Saul was filled with rage. Saul became very angry, and yes, he was angry at the song itself, but I think he was more angry at the fact of the reality of it, the truth of it. And that was that David was a very successful warrior when it came to fighting these wars. He was able to do a lot of what Saul wasn't able to accomplish in defeating this enemy, in defeating these Philistines time and time again. And so they just experienced this great military victory, and here is Saul, and here are all of his soldiers, and they're kind of making a victory march, if you will, throughout all the towns of Israel. And as they're nearing these towns, this group of women come running out of the city, and they begin singing this song. And that song was a song, of course, that honored David more than Saul. And that angered Saul. Saul thought, well, I'm the king of Israel. I'm the one who should be getting all the accolades. I'm the one who should be getting all the praise and the honor and the respect thrown my way. But instead, David is getting what I rightfully deserve. And so the result was that he was very angry. It displeased him. It irritated him. It annoyed him. And more importantly, it infuriated him. And so rage caused him to be a very difficult person for David to deal with. The second thing that you can see present within the life of Saul is the idea of resentment. And we might better label it even jealousy or envy. Envy is the result of a feeling that we have when we see someone with something we want. Or it's the feeling that we have whenever we see somebody achieve something that we want to achieve. And that's what Saul was seeing. He wanted to be the one who was being praised, but instead David was the one who was being praised. And so he envied the position that David was in. He was jealous of the honor that was being thrown his way. Probably one of the most famous or the most informative even verses in the Bible that we find about envy is found in Proverbs 27 and verse 4. And remember there that it's written, "Wrath is cruel, and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy?" Envy, the Bible tells us, God through His infinite wisdom tells us that envy is the most vicious of all feelings and all emotions that one human being can have toward another. And if I were to sit down and to ask you the question, what is one emotion or what is one feeling that you wouldn't want anybody to have towards you? The first thing that would pop into my mind is hatred. I don't want somebody to hate me. I don't want somebody to be angry with me. And notice what the wise man said here. He said, anger or wrath is cruel. Well, when you're dealing with somebody who has a very intense burning anger against you, there's cruelty that can happen at their hands. And then he says anger is an outrageous emotion or feeling to have to deal with. In other words, it's kind of like a flood, as it rushes into a village and just carries everything away with it. So wrath is cruel, anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? When you think about envy, a person, when you achieve something that another person wants to achieve, and they're envious because of you for it, when you get something that somebody else wants to get, you have it and they do not, then you're in a very, very difficult situation. And when you think about Saul and everything that happened between David and Saul, because Saul envied, Saul was jealous of David. Think about how many times his life was threatened because of that, where he almost died. Think about how many years he had to live in seclusion and to hide himself because Saul was envious of David. You think about the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, and the Bible tells us that his brothers were envious of him and the position that he occupied, and think about how they dealt with him. Envy is one of the most dangerous feelings and emotions that people can have toward us. And when they have that feeling or that emotion toward us, they become very difficult for us to deal with. In James chapter 3 and verse 16, James said, For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. Think about that statement. Where there is envy, there is every evil work. Think about the lawlessness that exists today because of envy. Think about the immorality that exists today because of envy. Think about the violence that is practiced today because of envy. You know, when you study envy in the life of Saul, it's very apparent that it became like this cancerous sword and just ate Saul up. It just consumed him. And so it absorbed all of his time. It absorbed all of his thoughts, and it really became his passion. That's what he was motivated by every day, was getting even with David or taking away from David what he wanted. What did it do to his life? It destroyed his life. I mean, Saul deteriorated both physically and mentally because he was so envious of David. And in fact, you might even say he was borderline insane, wasn't he? With this jealousy that he had for David. And not only did it destroy his life, but it also damaged the lives of David himself. Those who are envied are also going to be caught up in this destruction. And so you think about envy today. You know, rumors exist because of envy. Verbal attacks are launched because of envy. It's not uncommon for physical attacks to occur because of envy. And so Saul became a very difficult person to deal with because he was envious, he was jealous of what David had. The third thing that we can see within the life of Saul that caused him to be a difficult person was because he was running scared. If you notice in verse 12, it says, And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. You know, David just continually mounts victory after victory. Like we said, he was not only successful in these military campaigns, but it was anything that he put his hand to, anything that Saul put him in charge of, he won the victory or he was successful in it. And so what happens? Saul becomes afraid. Now you might think, well, why is Saul, the king of Israel, afraid of David? He's afraid that David's going to replace him. You know, here you have this man who's highly successful in everything that he does. And what's next? Well, the people of Israel are going to say, let's make this man our king. You know, let's replace him. Let's let him take over the throne of Saul. And so Saul feels threatened, and he wants to get rid of David as fast as he can. And so he takes David from being the commander of all his men of war, and he only puts him in charge of 1,000 men. What does that do? Well, that kind of limits Saul's dealings with David. It limits the amount of times he has to see him. It limits the amount of time that he has to speak to him. And so it kind of removes him out of his presence. And eventually, Saul, we're going to read about or at least talk about how Saul made numerous attempts on the life of David himself. And when that didn't work, he basically put out a royal hit, I guess you could say, on David's life. And so he wanted to get rid of David because he was scared, he was afraid that David was going to take his place. Now think about these things, and these are important because a lot of times when we're dealing with people who are difficult people for us to deal with, it's because of these reasons. Sometimes it's because they're angry at us or with us. Sometimes it's because they're jealous or envious of us, maybe what we have or what we've been able to accomplish. Sometimes they're afraid that we're going to replace them or what they're doing within a company or anything like that. And so what we need to understand, again, is not necessarily to try to sympathize with these people, but to understand it so that we don't find ourselves in that situation, find ourselves being a difficult person to deal with when it comes to other people. Here's some other observation or another observation that we can observe from these two chapters. Difficult people are going to require things of us that are nearly impossible. Notice in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 20 beginning, it says, "And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare unto him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore beest the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake those words in the ears of David, and David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. And Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal his daughter to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass, after they went forth, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. Now what happens? Well, one of Saul's daughters, Michal, falls in love with David. And they tell Saul. And you know, what do you think Saul's reaction would be to that? Well, I would think he would hate it, right? Here my daughter has fallen in love with David, but the Bible says the thing pleased him. And the reason that he pleased him is he said, this gives me an opportunity. You know, this gives me an opportunity even further to see that the life of David is taken from him. And so he sent his servants, and his servants were supposed to tell David, the king wants you to be his son-in-law. And so here's David, and he receives this message, and David says, wait a minute. You know, this is an impossible thing that you're asking of me. Why would David think it difficult, or why would he think it impossible to become the king's son-in-law? Because he's not a rich man. You know, he understands, and notice they talk about this idea of a dowry. You know, when a man married a princess, he paid the king a handsome sum. He owed the king a lot in order to be able to marry his daughter. And David said, I don't have anything to give the king. You know, I don't have any kind of dowry where I can pay him so that I can become his son-in-law. This isn't some light matter that we're talking about here. And so Saul said, you tell David, here's what I want. You know, instead of David paying me all this money, I'll just take 100 dead Philistines. Now, why did he say that? Because he thought David will get killed. You know, David will go out here and he'll try to kill 100 of these men, and that'll increase the chances. That will threaten his life more, or put his life more at risk. And so Saul has this elaborate thought, this elaborate plan within his head that if David's going to become his son-in-law, he has to kill 100 Philistines. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute here, fellas, this morning. What if when you wanted to marry your wife, your soon-to-be father-in-law came to you and said, you know what, you can marry my wife if you go out and kill 100 men. Those aren't very good odds, are they? I would say somewhere down the road, you might get one, you might get two, but somewhere down the road, something might happen and you're probably going to die. You know what David does, though? David kills 200 Philistines. And he comes back and he says, here's more than what you wanted for your daughter. But what was Saul asking of him? He was asking the nearly impossible, wasn't he? And that's what difficult people do. They ask you to do things that are just not humanly possible for a person to do. If God hadn't been with him, there's no way that he ever would have accomplished that. And so don't become a difficult person by expecting and asking people to do things that are impossible to do. We've got to avoid that situation. The third thing that we learn about dealing with difficult people is difficult people are the kind of people that will rook other people. And what we mean by that is that they'll deceive them, that they'll cheat them, they'll lie, they'll defraud them in any way that they can. Notice when you back up to verse 17 of 1 Samuel 18, we're not doing these in order, but we read about how Michal, one of Saul's daughters, fell in love with David. But if you go back to verse 17, it says, and Saul said to David, behold, my elder daughter, Merab, her will I give thee to wife, only be thou valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, who am I, and what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel the Maholathite to wife. This wasn't the first time that one of Saul's daughters had fallen in love with David. And not only that, but I want you to think back to last week whenever we studied David and Goliath. And remember, as David was talking to the different soldiers throughout Israel, they said, have you heard what's going to be done for the man who kills Goliath? Remember the three things that were said there? Number one, he would have great riches. Number two, he would marry into the royal family. And number three, he would be exempt from taxes. Part of the agreement, part of the promise that Saul had made to the person who killed Goliath was he would marry one of his daughters. And I think we're reading about right here a woman that had been promised to David. In fact, Saul already owed him his oldest daughter because he had killed Goliath. But you know what Saul does? He comes to David and he says, if you'll be my right-hand man in war, if you'll be valiant, if you'll fight the Lord's battles, if you'll be a great soldier, a great warrior for me, then I will give you my daughter to marry. And so why did Saul do that? Once again, he said, well, it's better if the Philistines kill him than me. You know, if I kill him, I'm going to get a lot of backlash from my own people. But if the enemy, if he falls at the hand of the enemy, nobody's going to say anything about it. And so what is he doing? He's trying to cheat David out of what is rightfully his. He's purposely deceiving David. And not only that, but David did what Saul asked him to do. He fought the Lord's battles. He was a very valiant man. But instead of giving him his oldest daughter to marry, he gave her to another man. And that's what difficult people do. They make great promises with their mouth, but they never carry through with those promises. And so Saul never intended to give David his oldest daughter to marry. He was just trying to use that daughter as bait, if you will, to increase the chances that David would die at the hands of the enemy. Now, go over to chapter 19. We're going to have to flip through some of this. We're not going to get to read all of it. But the first part of chapter 19, Lord willing, we'll talk about next week. We're going to talk about the idea of friendship with Jonathan and David. But you'll read about in the first part of chapter 19 how David and Jonathan formed this friendship. And even for a time, Saul and David are reconciled. And so remember how we read about Saul's next daughter in line, Michal. She loved David. And so Saul says, well, if you'll if you'll give me the foreskins of 100 Philistines, then I'll call it good. That can be your dowry for this marriage. Well, David did that. And so Michal and David get married. So in verse 11, here's Michal and David, and here they are within their house. And Saul sends messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster and covered it with a cloth. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He is sick. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may slay him. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. And Saul said unto Michal, Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away my enemy, that he is escaped? And Michal answered Saul, He said unto me, Let me go, why should I kill thee? So David fled and escaped, and came to Samuel to Ramah, and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and dwelt in Naioth. Once again, we read about Saul using his daughter for bait, if you will, to try to kill David. Now remember, the Bible says this woman loved David. She had married him out of pure reasons. But Saul did not share in the affection that she had for David. And so Saul was having David watched within his house. And he says, tomorrow we're going to kill David. He's confined in his house. We got him trapped. And so we'll surround him and we'll kill him. Well, somehow his daughter finds out about the plot, and she tells David, if you don't get out of here tonight, tomorrow you're going to be dead. And so under the cover of darkness, she let David out of the window of the house, down the wall, and he escapes. And the next day, Saul comes in, or at least his servants do, and they say, Saul wants to talk with David. Well, she said, he can't talk, he's sick right now. And so the messengers come back, and they say, well, he's sick in bed. And Saul says, bring him in his bed. Just carry the bed and all up here. And we'll take care of him right here and right now. Well, it's interesting that when they carry the bed up, they actually find some kind of statue in the bed. And they find how she's arranged it to look like a person. And Saul is so offended. He looks at his daughter, and think about the irony of this statement. How can you be so deceptive with me? How can you try to pull one over on me, if you will? Well, think about how deceptive he had been with David. He had cheated him out of what rightfully belonged to him, his oldest daughter. He had tried to kill him under the guise of friendship. And not only that, but think about how deceptive he'd been in dealing with his own daughter. He used his own daughter as bait. Think about that. And now he's offended because his daughter has been deceptive with him. Well, friends, that's a sign of a difficult person. A difficult person will lie, they'll cheat, they'll steal, they'll rob, they'll defraud a person in any way that they can in order to get what they want. And so that was what David was dealing with in the life of Saul. Now, we've kind of talked about, the identifying marks, I guess, if you will, of difficult people. We want to talk about what's the remedy? How do you deal with difficult people? Because obviously David had to deal with Saul, even though he was still a difficult person. And I think there's three things that are really important that we read about within this chapter. The first thing is you need to regard your behavior. You have to be careful about the way you behave in front of a difficult person. It's interesting as you read about David. In 1 Samuel 18 and verse 5, it says, David went out whithersoever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. It said again in verse 14, and David behaved himself wisely in all of his ways, and the Lord was with him. In verse 30, it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. You understand what's going on here? David is being very, very careful in the presence of Saul. He's paying close attention to his words that he uses in the presence of Saul. He's paying very close attention to his actions around Saul. And not only that, but we didn't really get into the details of it, but he's also keeping one eye open. You remember how many times Saul takes his javelin, tries to throw it and stick David to the wall? But he's keeping his eye on Saul, right? He's being very careful. He's paying attention. He's being very wise in the presence of Saul. That's one of the things you have to do with a difficult person. You have to be careful what you say around him. You have to be careful about what you do around him. You have to, if you will, keep one eye open. Don't turn your back, because if you do, something bad might happen. And so be aware of your behavior in the presence of those people. The second thing that we read about David doing is he refused to take vengeance on Saul. You know, again, the first part of chapter 19, I talked about how David and Jonathan meet, and Jonathan learns about Saul's plot to take David's life. And he tells David, he says, let me talk to my dad, and I'll try to talk some sense into him. So he goes to his dad, and he says, what in the world's going on here? Why are you trying to kill David? What did he do to you? What has he ever done personally to try to attack you or take away anything from you? And the Bible says that Saul thought about it for a minute, and he said, you know what, you're right. This is ridiculous. And so he and David kind of repaired that friendship. Now, David acted like he was supposed to act. He didn't say, no, I'm not going to be friends with Saul anymore. He tried to kill me, tried to stick a spear right through me. Or he tried to put a hit out on my life. I don't want anything to do with that man. Instead, if you look in verse 8, it says there was a war again, and David went out and fought the Philistines. What did he do? He fought for his king. He fought for Saul. If you notice in verse 9, the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, and as he sat in the house with his javelin in his hand, David played with his harp. Did he say, I remember that time you tried to stick me with a spear, I'm not going to play for you anymore? No, he didn't. He said, my king is in need, and I'm going to do whatever I can to help my king. So he plays the harp for him. You see, there's no vengeance in the life of David. He's not trying to take matters into his own hand. I'm reminded of Romans 12 and beginning in verse 19. Paul said, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto vengeance. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. For in doing so, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. What does the Bible teach us about vengeance? Save it, leave it to God. Vengeance belongs to God. So if we see our enemy in need of something, help them. Show them the better spirit that they showed you. Show them the power of kindness and the power of benevolence, and through that, shame them into the way that they've treated you. And that's exactly what David tried to do with Saul. So whenever we're dealing with difficult people, we need to refuse to take vengeance in our own hands. And the last thing I'll mention here, the third thing, we need to try to find the risible in the things that's happened. I was running out of R's here. That was a tough one. But it means humor. It means humor. Now you might think, how is this humorous in any way? You go on and you read in chapter 19. Remember, David is let down over the wall by his wife, and he runs to Samuel. The Bible says that he and Samuel hang out in Naioth. Well, Saul hears about David and Samuel being in Naioth, and you guess what he does? He immediately sends this group of his soldiers, this platoon, if you will, he sends them out to go and to capture David and to bring him out. And if you read on, what happens is, as they get near to Naioth, the Spirit of God comes on them and they all start prophesying. Instead of them capturing David, they become prophets. And so they say, we can't do this, we got to go back and tell Saul. So he goes back, the first group go back and they tell Saul. And so Saul says, I'll send somebody else that you guys can't do it. So he puts another platoon together and he sends them out. And as they draw near Naioth, they start prophesying. So they turn around, they come back, and they say, we can't do it. Every time we get near to this city, we start prophesying. So he says, I'll show you guys, I'll put together another platoon. And he puts together a third platoon of soldiers. He sends them out. As soon as they get close to Naioth, guess what happens? They begin prophesying. Third group of soldiers come back. They say, there's no way that we can do it. Saul says, I'll tell you what, I'll take care of it myself. And the Bible says that Saul set out to capture David, and guess what happens as soon as he gets near nailing it. He starts prophesying. And in fact, if you notice in verse 24 a little bit more, he stripped off all his clothes, he prophesied before Samuel, and he lay down naked all that day and all that night. That's kind of humorous to me. You know, here is Saul, and in his great power and his great wisdom, he said, I'm going to show everybody who's boss here. And he can't do it. He can't do it. It's interesting when you study the Bible. There's a lot of human characters and emotions that are often assigned to God. Have you ever thought about laughter? Laughter is one of the emotions that is assigned to God at times. And all of these emotions that we experience as humans, they're just extensions of divine emotions. They really are. God experiences the same things that we experience. What does that tell you? That tells me that God has a sense of humor. Where does the idea of humor or laughter come from? It's not just from a human emotion. It's an extension of a divine characteristic. And I know at times when difficult things are happening to us, it's often hard to smile. But if you can learn to smile, if you can find something just a little bit humorous, if you can find something to bring a little bit of joy into your life, it'll help you out in these difficult times. You know, as we study this lesson this morning, obviously dealing with difficult people is something that we're all going to encounter if we haven't already in this life. What we don't want to do is become one of those difficult people to deal with. How can we keep from doing that? Try to keep from becoming angry at people. Try to keep from becoming jealous and envious of other people. Try to keep from becoming afraid or threatened that somebody else is going to take your job or something like that. Don't ask people to do something that's impossible, like Saul asked of David to kill those 100 Philistines. That's what a difficult person does. Don't try to lie and cheat and defraud people to get your way. That's a difficult person that we're dealing with here. So what can we do if we're dealing with a difficult person in life right now? Regard your behavior. Be careful. Be careful about what you say in front of them. Be careful about how you behave in front of them. Don't turn your back, because the minute you do, you're going to get in trouble. The second thing, refuse to take vengeance into your own hands. Leave that for God. If you find a difficult person in a situation where they need something, help. Show them the power of kindness. Show them the power of benevolence. Try to shame them into the way that they've treated you through being kind and benevolent to them. That's what David did to Saul. And then the third thing is, try to find something to smile about. Try to find a little bit of humor in all of it. And that can often help you in a very difficult situation. Maybe there's one here this morning who's not yet a child of God. The invitation is open for you now to become one. If you need to obey the gospel, or you need to restore your life here in Aryan Christian, why not come forward at this time while together we all stand and sing?